Alexander Voss lived in a world made of glass and silence where everything he touched turned a profit, but nothing felt real anymore. The city watched him from below as if he were a figure sculpted out of light and distance. His office stood 50 floors above the noise, all white marble and cold precision. Yet behind that perfection there was a man who trusted no one. His empire was built on vigilance and control, and every face around him seemed to wear a mask of ambition. Then came Elena Cruz, the new secretary whose presence softened the edges of the sterile corridors. She moved quietly, always early, always efficient, never demanding attention, yet her kindness unsettled him more than arrogance ever could. She left small notes of encouragement on colleagues' desks, smiled at the janitor, and stayed late to organize reports that weren't even haze. Alexander watched her from the glass reflection of his office door and wondered how someone could remain so gentle in a place built on competition. But soon his curiosity began to twist into suspicion. Her phone would ring, and she would step out for a moment longer than necessary. Some files he expected to be on his desk were delayed. She sometimes left the building in a hurry, looking over her shoulder as if afraid of something unseen. Alexander's mind, trained by betrayal and experience, began to connect shadows that may not have existed. In a world where everyone wanted something, he could not believe that kindness came without a motive. It started with a whisper of doubt that grew louder with every passing day. His CFO Marcus mentioned one evening that a few confidential reports had been accessed outside of business hours. The security system flagged Elena's credentials. Marcus suggested a background check, but Alexander hesitated. Still, once the seed of mistrust was planted, it took root quickly. He began noticing more things: the phone calls she took in private, the way she hid a small notebook when someone walked by, the envelope she tucked into her purse before leaving. He replayed her movements in his head like a security reel, and convinced himself she was hiding something valuable. Maybe she was selling company data. Maybe she was meeting with rivals. The uncertainty gnawed at him, pulling him back into the same darkness he had once escaped when he built his fortune. He knew he could not confront her without proof. The calmness of her smile felt rehearsed. Her gratitude sounded like strategy, and her eyes, once warm, now looked like veiled windows he needed to open. Late one night in his penthouse, he sat staring at the city lights and decided to follow his instincts. He would no longer wonder who Elena Cruz really was. He would find out. The next morning, Alexander made a call to Derek Lane, a retired detective who specialized in private surveillance for high-profile clients. Derek's voice was calm and professional, a man who had seen too much and judged too little. Within a day, Elena's routine was under quiet observation. Cameras captured her leaving the office after hours, taking the subway instead of her car, and traveling into the poorer districts of the city. She stopped by a dimly lit apartment complex, handed a small envelope to an older woman waiting outside, and stayed only a few minutes before leaving. Alexander received the first report with photographs spread across his desk. The images showed no luxury, no deceit, only modest living in tired faces. But to him, the mystery deepened. The next few days revealed more of the same. She worked an extra shift at a diner late at night under a false name. She visited a hospital on weekends and spent hours in the pediatric ward. Derek mentioned that she seemed to be helping a woman who was sick and frail. Alexander didn't believe it at first. He demanded more footage, more context, something that explained why his secretary, earning a solid salary, would lead a life like that. The puzzle became an obsession. He watched her through a detective's lens, trying to decode her choices, every movement feeding his confusion. There were no meetings with competitors, no money exchanges beyond the small envelopes, no sign of betrayal. Yet Alexander could not let it go. The deeper he looked, the less sense it made. His empire was built on logic, but Elena's life defied it. Days blended into restless nights as Alexander's obsession deepened. The detective sent him new reports filled with grainy photos and timestamps that revealed a pattern of quiet sacrifice rather than deceit. Elena's routine was relentless: office work by day, diner shifts by night, hospital visits on weekends. The woman she helped turned out to be her mother, living in a worn apartment with cracked walls and fading wallpaper. Alexander studied every frame, waiting for evidence of conspiracy, yet all he found was struggle and exhaustion. Still, he convinced himself there had to be more. No one could be this selfless without hiding something. He authorized Derek to continue watching, to dig deeper, to uncover the missing piece. But instead of secrets, Derek's findings only exposed layers of ordinary pain that Alexander had long forgotten existed. One evening, Alexander stared at the photograph spread across his desk, the mother clutching Elena's hand, the late-night diner, the hospital hallway glowing pale under fluorescent light. Something inside him began to soften, but pride refused to yield. He told himself he was simply protecting his company. Deep down, he knew he was protecting something else, his fear of being wrong about people. One rainy evening, Alexander dismissed a detective and decided to follow her himself. He traded his tailored suit for a plain jacket and drove without a driver, blending into the city he usually watched from above. He found her at the hospital, kneeling beside a bed surrounded by children whose laughter echoed through sterile halls. She handed out small toys and read stories until her voice trembled with fatigue. Later, she walked to a corner shop, bought medicine, and headed to her mother's apartment. Alexander parked nearby and watched through the drizzle-spattered windshield as Elena helped her mother sit up, fed her soup, and placed a hand on her forehead with the care of someone who had learned patience through pain. When her mother fell asleep, Elena sat in silence, her face lit by the weak glow of a desk lamp as she opened her notebook and began writing. The world outside that window looked nothing like the world Alexander ruled. It was smaller, quieter, and achingly human. He felt something he couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or envy of a life built on love rather than control. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed, standing there unseen, watching a truth he had never lived. He drove home long after midnight, his reflection in the car window looking like a stranger's. That night, sleep avoided him. The images of Elena's quiet world looped in his mind until they began to blend with memories he had buried long ago. He saw himself as a boy, sitting in a dim apartment much like Hayes, watching his mother scrub floors for the wealthy families of the city. He remembered her hands, rough and red, and her voice telling him that dignity was worth more than gold. When she died, he swore to never be poor again. But with every success, that vow twisted into something colder, harder, until it became a wall between him and everyone else. Now, as he stared at the ceiling of his penthouse, Alexander realized that the life he'd built to honor her had somehow erased her entirely. Elena's sacrifices echoed the same rhythm his mother once lived, a rhythm of quiet endurance that no fortune could buy. The memory struck him with a force he hadn't expected. He thought of the envelopes, the diner shifts, the hospital visits, all acts of love performed in silence. The paranoia that once justified his actions began to crack. He saw now that he had followed Elena not to expose her, but to confront something in himself he had long denied. As dawn broke over the city, the glass walls of his home caught the first light, and Alexander Voss, the man who thought he could see everything, finally realized how blind he had been. Morning arrived wrapped in tension that only Alexander could feel. The sight of Elena at her desk, calm and focused, made his chest tighten with unspoken guilt. He had seen too much, known too much, and yet she smiled at him as if nothing existed beyond the walls of the office. He told himself he would confront her, demand the truth, but when she stepped into his office, holding a stack of reports, the words died before they reached his lips. He studied her face, the faint circles beneath her eyes, the weariness that work could not hide, and something in him faltered. Instead of accusation, he spoke of promotion, of a raise, of gratitude for her effort. She declined softly, saying she had enough, that others needed it more. Her simplicity disarmed him. He watched her walk away and realized the power he had never understood, the power of humility. The urge to confess what he had done, to admit that he had trailed her, burned within him, but shame forced him to stay silent. The billionaire behind the glass walls, who could command cities to move, could not summon the courage to face a single honest woman. The call came unexpectedly. The receptionist entered his office, pale and hesitant, holding the phone that carried news he did not expect. Elena's mother had collapsed. The hospital had contacted the company because Elena's emergency contact list mentioned the corporate line. Without hesitation, Alexander left a meeting, his car slicing through traffic as he rushed toward the address he already knew too well. The sterile corridors smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. He found Elena standing by her mother's bed, hands trembling as she adjusted the blanket. Her eyes were red, But when she saw him, confusion flickered across her face. He told her not to worry about work, and she nodded, whispering thanks that carried more sincerity than any business deal he'd ever made. He stayed longer than necessary, sitting in the corner unnoticed as nurses moved quietly around them. He watched her hold her mother's hand through the night, whispering words he could not hear, and for the first time, the silence felt sacred. In the hum of hospital machines and the flicker of fluorescent light, he saw the fragility of everything he had once considered stable. When dawn came, she fell asleep in the chair beside her mother, and he slipped away quietly, the image of that fragile devotion imprinted in his mind like confession he could never unsee. The next morning, the nurse recognized Alexander from the night before and, in a small mistake born of exhaustion, handed him a notebook she thought belonged to him. It was Elena's, the same small book he had seen her protect countless times. He meant to return it immediately, but curiosity and guilt tangled together until his resolve broke. He opened it slowly, each page filled with neat handwriting and careful words. There were no financial notes, no secrets, only letters addressed to him, never meant to be read. They told stories of gratitude, of hope, of silent admiration for the man who had given her a chance when no one else would. She wrote of his brilliance and his loneliness, of how she wished she could tell him that kindness mattered more than vision. Each line felt like a mirror held up to his soul, exposing what he had become. By the time he closed the notebook, the weight of his mistake was unbearable. He had followed her searching for betrayal, and found instead the reflection of his own emptiness. He returned the notebook quietly, placing it on her desk without a word. When she later smiled and thanked him for retrieving it, he could barely look her in the eye. The walls around his heart, built from years of power and mistrust, had begun to crumble, and in the quiet space between guilt and revelation, Alexander Voss finally understood that he was the one who had been lost all along. The morning light slipped through the blinds of Alexander's office like an unwelcome truth. 4 hours he sat staring at the city skyline, the weight of the notebook heavy in his memory. Every letter Elena had written pulsed in his mind until the silence became unbearable. When she arrived at her desk, moving with the same calm grace as always, he knew he could no longer hide behind his position. He asked her to step inside, his voice steady but his heart unmoved. She stood before him, hands clasped, unaware that the man across from her had trespassed into the private corners of her life. The words came out raw and halting. He told her he had hired someone to follow her, that he had doubted her, that he had read the notebook by mistake. The air between them turned heavy, almost unbreathable. Her expression did not harden, it broke. There was no anger, only quiet disbelief. She nodded once, her lips trembling as she whispered that trust was a fragile thing to destroy. Then she walked out without another word, leaving Alexander staring at the open door, the echo of her footsteps mocking the sound of his shame. For the first time, power offered no comfort, and success felt like a hollow crown pressing into his skull. That night he sat alone, surrounded by silence that finally spoke back, reminding him that truth, once lost, rarely returns unchanged. Days passed like penance. The office felt colder without her presence, the rhythm of his empire disrupted by absence. Alexander threw himself into wake, but nothing quieted the guilt that trailed him through every meeting and every boardroom. He decided to make amends in the only way he knew how, by action, not words. Through a private account, he cleared the hospital bills of Elena's mother and arranged for a renovation of their small apartment. He thought it would ease the weight pressing on his chest, but when Elena discovered the truth, she appeared at his office doorway, her eyes burning with pride and hurt. She told him she didn't want to be anyone's charity, that kindness should not feel like payment for guilt. He wanted to explain that it wasn't charity, it was gratitude, but the words faltered. Instead, he told her she reminded him of the man he used to be before success replaced compassion. The words came like confession, soft but honest. She didn't respond, yet something in her gaze shifted, a flicker of understanding, fragile but real. When she left, the air in the room felt lighter, though the wound between them remained open. Redemption, he realized, was not a transaction. It was a slow rebuilding of trust, brick by trembling brick. Weeks passed before she began speaking to him again. It started with short exchanges about schedules, then brief discussions about work, each moment tentative but genuine. The distance between them softened into something unfamiliar, respect. Alexander had been planning a new project, a foundation aimed at helping underprivileged women enter the workforce, inspired by what he had learned through Elena's struggle. One evening, he handed her the proposal and asked if she would consider helping him shape it. She hesitated, unsure whether this was another act of guilt or something deeper. But as she read through the pages, she saw sincerity in the idea, a vision born not of pity but of transformation. They began working together after hours, building something meaningful from shared effort. She brought compassion to the numbers, he brought structure to her ideals, and together they created balance. As the project grew, so did the quiet understanding between them. The silence that once divided them now connected them, filled with unspoken forgiveness. The day they finalized the foundation plan, Alexander looked at her and realized he no longer saw an employee. He saw the bridge between who he was and who he might become. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered, and for the first time in his life, they looked less like victory and more like hope. The day the first headline appeared, the calm they had built began to tremble. A tabloid had published photographs of Alexander and Elena leaving the hospital together months before, paired with careless words that turned compassion into scandal. Rumors spread faster than truth, feeding on curiosity and envy. News outlets painted their story as forbidden romance, secret favoritism, or manipulation. The board demanded explanations. Shareholders panicked, and Alexander found himself surrounded by noise he could not control. Through it all, Elena remained silent, her face composed but pale, enduring the whispers that followed her through the corridors. Alexander watched as gossip carved at her dignity and realized that every attempt to protect her had only drawn her into his storm. He stepped before the cameras, his voice even, his expression unreadable, and stated that the woman being attacked was the most honest person he had ever met, that her integrity had become the moral foundation of his company's new chapter. His statement silenced some but fueled others. For days, articles multiplied, opinions divided, but a strange thing began to happen. People who had known kindness recognized it in his words. They saw the humanity behind the scandal. The chaos he had feared slowly became the proof of something real, and in defending her, Alexander found his own truth reborn in the eyes of the world. The story refused to fade. It spread across platforms, carried by strangers who found pieces of themselves in its quiet redemption. Messages flooded Elena's inbox from women working 2 jobs, from single mothers juggling survival and hope, from students who had once believed no one noticed them. What had started as gossip evolved into inspiration. The world began to see not a scandal but a symbol, a billionaire learning humanity from the woman who lived it daily. Alexander watched it unfold from his office window, the city below humming with movement, and for the first time, he did not feel separate from it. The company began to change under this new light. Employees treated one another differently, small act of care replacing competition. Investors once focused on profit now spoke of purpose. Elena continued to work quietly, declining interviews, refusing fame. Her strength was a simplicity, her refusal to become a spectacle. Yet the more she resisted attention, the more people admired her. Alexander saw how her quiet integrity had done what his power never could, heal. The world was watching, and for once, he did not fear it. The man who had once followed her in suspicion now followed her example, learning that influence was not built on wealth but on the silent ripples of a good heart. One evening, long after the noise had calmed and the city outside glowed with a gentle pulse of night, Alexander invited Elena to the rooftop of the headquarters. The wind was cool, carrying the hum of traffic from below, and the light stretched endlessly toward the horizon. He did not bring flowers. He did not prepare speeches. He brought only the truth of what she had changed in him. Standing beside her, he handed her a folder containing the official launch of their foundation, complete with her name beside his. He told her it was not a gift but a partnership, that he wanted her to lead it with him. She read through the papers silently, the lights flickering in her eyes, understanding that this was not a proposal of love but of purpose. Together they looked over the city that had once divided them, and for a moment it felt smaller, kinder. The rooftop that had once been his place of isolation became the beginning of something new. The skyline no longer mirrored his power but her perseverance. As she accepted the role, a quiet shift settled between them. Not romance, not obligation, but connection built on truth. Below them, the city pulsed with life, unaware that high above, 2 people had finally learned that redemption is not spoken, it is lived. The launch day arrived beneath a sky washed clean by early rain, and for the first time in years Alexander felt something like peace. The new foundation stood not as a monument to wealth, but as a promise rebuilt from humility. The hall was filled with people who had known struggle, whose stories mirrored Elena's, whose hands carried the same quiet strength. Cameras flashed, reporters asked questions, and though Alexander had built empires, this moment felt different. He stood beside Elena as she took the podium, her posture steady, her words measured, her voice unshaken. She spoke not of charity but of opportunity, of dignity, of second chances. The audience listened, not because of her title but because of her truth. When the applause rose, Alexander didn't feel like a leader. He felt like a student. As weeks turned into months, the Voskruz Foundation began to breathe on its own. It offered jobs, housing, and education to women who had fallen through the cracks of society. The results were quiet but profound, a chain reaction of small victories that spread across the city. Alexander found himself visiting shelters and schools, learning names, hearing stories that reshaped him. Elena moved through it all with calm purpose, the same composure that had once made him suspicious now inspiring everyone around her. Together they had built something that no amount of power alone could have created, and in that creation, Alexander discovered that legacy was not measured in numbers but in lives touched. Late one night, long after the day's events had faded into the hum of the city, Alexander sat in his study surrounded by shadows and silence. The foundation was thriving, the company stronger than ever, yet something within him remained unsettled. He reached for a pen and began to write, the motion slow at first, then urgent, as if the words had waited too long to escape. The letter began as an apology but became something more, a confession of regret, of admiration, of the lesson she had taught him without trying. He wrote that he had once seen her as a mystery to solve, but had discovered instead a mirror reflecting everything he had lost. He admitted his fear of vulnerability, his failure to trust, his recognition that his strength had rebuilt the humanity in him that wealth had eroded. When the ink dried, he folded the letter neatly, sealed it, and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. He could not bring himself to give it to her. Some truths, he realized, were meant to exist quietly, to serve as reminders rather than revelations. The letter remained there, a silent witness to the man he had become, unsent but alive, waiting for the moment when courage might finally overcome fear. It was a gray morning when the call came that would undo him again. Elena's mother had passed away peacefully in her sleep, the battle finally ending in silence. Alexander arrived at the small funeral without announcement, standing at the edge of the crowd, unseen but present. The ceremony was simple, attended by few, heavy with the quiet dignity that had defined both women's lives. After the service, Elena approached the small table where her mother's belongings were placed, among them a sealed envelope addressed to her. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the page before glancing up in surprise. Inside, folded among her mother's final words, was another letter, the one Alexander had written and never delivered. Her mother had found it while cleaning his office weeks before, mistaking it for something important and keeping it safe. As she read, the air seemed to still. The words poured into her like truth rediscovered, each line revealing the depth of remorse and gratitude he had buried. The tears came quietly, not from pain but from understanding. When she looked across the cemetery, she saw him standing there, distant yet open, no longer the man who was behind glass walls but one stripped bare by loss and truth. She nodded once, a gesture that carried forgiveness, and in that moment the story that had begun with suspicion found its way to grace. Time moved gently in the months that followed, carrying away the heaviness that once filled every corner of their lives. The foundation grew, expanding beyond the city into places where opportunity had long been forgotten. Elena devoted herself to the work, her calm resolve transforming sorrow into purpose. Alexander accompanied her on visits to communities that had never seen hope arrive in such quiet form. He began to speak less and listen more, watching how small gestures, books for children, training for mothers, roofs rebuilt over tired homes, became seeds of change. One afternoon they traveled to a town on the edge of the coast, where an abandoned warehouse had been converted into a learning center. The walls were painted in bright colors, laughter echoed from the rooms, and Elena's eyes lit with pride as she walked through the halls. At the back of the building hung a plaque inscribed with words she had written. Kindness is the only wealth that multiplies when shared. Alexander stood before it in silence, realizing that everything he had built before this moment had been preparation for this truth. Later, they drove to the neighborhood where he had grown up, to a modest house that had once been his mother's. He had rebuilt it into a community center, its doors open to children after school, its walls filled with art and warmth. Standing there beside Elena, he felt the past and present merge into something whole. He saw in her the continuation of everything his mother had once dreamed for him, a life not measured by what he owned but by what he gave. The sun sank low, casting long shadows across the street, and for the first time, Alexander felt completely at peace, as though the restless hunger that had driven him for decades had finally found it home. Months later, a young journalist researching modern philanthropy uncovered the story that neither Alexander nor Elena had ever tried to tell. She pieced together the fragments: the billionaire who had once followed his secretary, the investigation born of mistrust, the discovery of quiet goodness that changed everything. The article appeared online with no fanfare, but within hours it spread across platforms, shared by millions who found hope in its simplicity. The headline read, "He followed her to find betrayal, but found his soul instead." Comments poured in from around the world. People moved not by wealth or fame, but by transformation. The story became a mirror for those who had forgotten the power of empathy, proof that change begins not with grand gestures but with humility. In a quiet interview, filmed in the modest community center where it had all begun, Alexander sat beside Elena as she spoke of forgiveness, of the strange beauty that can grow from broken trust. He listened, his eyes reflecting the calm of a man who no longer needed to control his world. The video went viral within days, viewed by millions, turning them into witnesses of redemption. Yet for Alexander and Elena, the numbers meant little. Their reward was simpler: the laughter of children in classrooms they had built, the letters from women who had found new beginnings through their foundation, the stillness of evenings spent without fear or pride. As the camera faded to black, Alexander's voice, steady and reflective, narrated the final thought, that the greatest discoveries are made not in pursuit of others, but in the pursuit of understanding oneself. The story ended where it had begun, with a man watching a woman from afar. But this time the distance was filled not with suspicion, but with awe. And as the world shared their story, two lives once divided by mistrust became a testament to the quiet, enduring power of grace.